So, I'm not going to provide exact locations for this one, as this happened on the trail that my mum and I used to walk the dog on every day for like 10 years, and as such, it was pretty close to our house. But I lived in a rural part of the PNW, and so there's a lot of trails just outside of town that bordered on a lot of forest. This was one of those, but it was probably the biggest trail in my town. It was actually an access road to some stuff, I think, so it was like 10 feet wide and gravel. And at the time that I briefly went missing, I was about 10 years old and had walked that trail every single day for like 3 to 4 years. My mum was with me, as was our dog, 85 pounds, Rottweiler Lab Aussie mix. I'd been warned not to go off the trail and wouldn't have normally, but there was a small sub-trail that had a rope swing over a creek. I loved to play there as a kid, and that day I crossed the creek, a fallen tree bridge, to hang out on the other side while Mum talked to a friend that she ran into. I was within sight of my mum, clear view across the creek, when all of a sudden, it was like things just swirled. My surroundings were completely unfamiliar, and there were plants that shouldn't have been there. The wrong kind of trees with leaves at slightly the wrong point for the season. Of course, I knew what to do if I got lost. I hugged a tree and shouted for my mum. I was probably 300 yards away at absolute most, maybe under 100 yards. She should have heard me, but she didn't. Thankfully, I wasn't there for very long before our dog came and got me. He wasn't a very smart dog. With all love, saying that he was as dumb as a bag of rocks would have been an insult to the rocks, to be honest. He also didn't like me nearly as much as he liked my mum, totally a mama's boy. And would have stayed near her normally, but he calmly walked up to me, nuzzled my hand so that it was on his head, and then he just walked me back out of the creek where I could see my mum. I thought that I must have been gone for like 15 minutes or so, but apparently it was an hour plus, and multiple people were now looking for me, including walking directly on the path that I'd never left. So this happened in June of 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I understand too that I acted like an idiot in this situation. Since then, I have become much more observant, cautious, and honestly just much more paranoid. So, I went dancing with some friends and was really drunk by midnight. Unfortunately, this was back when I had little money, and I realized that you could save money by eating very little before going out, and it would take far fewer drinks to get drunk. So I was so drunk that I barely remember my friend ordering me an Uber home. My phone was dead, of course. I can vaguely recall them helping me into the car and telling me to get home safe. I don't remember greeting the driver or the first minute or so, but soon after getting in, he asked how my night was and if I smoked. Honestly, I was just thinking about bed at this point, so I just sort of slurred out that I did sometimes. He then offered me a joint, and this is the first moment that I sort of got nervous and began paying attention. I tell him something like I'm really tired and just ready to get home. I think he said something about it being an indica-based joint and it made for great sleep. Well, once again, I say something not exactly like no, but not a yes, which he takes as a yes, I'll have that joint now. Well, once again, I'm still drunk enough that I can barely see straight or speak clearly, so when he says, okay, well, I have to cancel the ride really quick because I can't give it to you while I'm on the clock, or something to that effect, it takes me a second to realize just how dangerous that is. And by the time that I start to say something, he's already cancelled the ride and pulls over. We're in an area just east of Hawthorne Bridge, I think anyway, and it was totally secluded. Some empty parking lots, a closed auto body shop, no one in sight. It's starting to hit me that I'm now in the car and not with an Uber driver, but with some stranger. I can't call anyone, and he's trying to give me weed, and that could have anything in it. For the next minute or so, we're pretty quiet, or I just can't remember any small talk that he tried to make because I was beginning to panic. And every time that he handed me the joint, I would take fake hits, just breathing it into my mouth and not into my lungs. Honestly, too, I felt tired and clumsy and weak, that kind of drunk where you're almost at the point of nausea, and I knew that I couldn't do much of anything to defend myself at that point. I remember vividly being fixated for a moment on the fact that I didn't even have a pair of keys to defend myself with, as my building used fobs for just about everything, and I didn't take my mail key with me. As I'm freaking out, I look up to see if this guy is sort of noticing, and I make eye contact with him in the mirror. He was staring at me too, but I couldn't read his expression. Finally, he says something along the lines of, "Well, let's get out of here." I tell him that I'll just call another Uber to get home, thinking at this point that it might even be safer to walk. And he says, "No, I still have your address, and I'll just take you home." For a moment, I was relieved, to be honest. I guess I wanted to believe him so badly that I would get home safe that I just believed him. So I tried to calm myself down, thinking that he hadn't actually done anything threatening. Maybe he was just your typical stoner guy, and maybe I was just overreacting. At this time, I lived on PSU campus in downtown Portland, in the southwest area of the city. He's driving me north on the east side of the river. There are several bridges to our left, and as he keeps moving north, he has several opportunities to take an exit to hop over the river and get me back downtown. But he just keeps skipping them. We keep passing bridge after bridge that could get me home. Up in northeast Portland, there are some large industrial areas that can get very isolated at night, and Portland in general is surrounded by lots of forests, so I knew that he could have me in a secluded area really quickly. After he passes like the fourth exit for a bridge, pretty sure it was the Broadway Bridge, I've been racking my brain for a way to make him actually take me home, and say something to the effect of, "Hey, my boyfriend is waiting for me at home." Which was actually true, though I said it in a very meek way. My driver says nothing, but he did take the next exit for a bridge, and basically hung a giant U-turn that started taking me home. Even as we're on the west side of town heading south, though, I'm still shaking and have my hand on the door handle, thinking about just hopping out at a red light the closer that we get to my apartment. My phone is completely dead, and he honestly still has several chances to hop onto nearby highways and just speed out of the city if he wanted to. We're getting pretty close to my apartment now, and I'm once again trying to convince myself that I'm being paranoid about some stoner that can't navigate the city. Although, a few times before, I was so scared that I was crying. So, once we get about 2 blocks from my apartment, I lie and I tell him that it's easiest to stop here and he can let me out. Again, he doesn't say anything, but does slow the car. I'm flooded with relief too, and even feel myself smile, but when I go to open the door, it's locked. I try to lift the lock mechanism manually, but it won't budge. I look up at him instinctually to see what's up, and he's got his head turned almost fully toward me, shoulders still facing the road, smiling at me. The worst smile that I've ever seen. It looked so mocking, and it just didn't reach to his eyes at all. I just started crying and asking him to open the door. I was so freaked out and still really drunk, and thank God he did. I will never forget the sensation of vulnerability, not just being drunk in his car with no way to contact anyone, but even as I got out of that car, I kept feeling like he would somehow grab the back of my shirt and pull me back in, as silly as that sounds. When I got home, I found out my boyfriend had actually gone out with friends last minute and wasn't even home in the end. He wouldn't have even have known till much later if I hadn't gotten back safely. The next day, though, I convinced myself that I was just freaking out over nothing, which I realized could still be the case, but in my gut, I had truly felt in danger that night. Technically, this guy could have been totally harmless, I know that, but still, I still think I should have texted my friend and had her report him. The big thing, though, that made me think of this was recently hearing about how Ed Kemper, co-ed killer, would go for practice runs, picking up hitchhikers and seeing if he could get the passengers, potential victims, to trust him or how far out of his comfort zone he could push them without them saying anything. Obviously, this guy wasn't Ed Kemper, but I hate wondering if that night was a practice run of sorts for my Uber driver. Anyway, thanks to whoever has listened to this all the way through, and I'm at the point in my life where I'm realizing just how much danger I put myself in when I was younger, and just honestly depressed. It has made me both surprised and deeply grateful too that I am still here. I'm 28 years old, but when I was about 5 years old, my mum and I lived in this duplex that was off a main road and kind of in a bit of a wooded area. We lived on one side, and on the other was a woman and her son there. He was studying to be a teacher, I think. My mother had me young, so she was about 25, and this guy was in his early 20s. He would often come and talk to my mum, and my mother said that he would ask a lot of questions about me and ask my mother if it would be alright for him to take me for walks in the woods. Obviously, my mother always declined. My mother worked in the operating room at the local hospital and was on call a lot, so most weekends I just stayed at my grandma's house anyway. But one night, while I was at my grandma's house, my mum was home alone sleeping, and she woke up in the middle of the night and said that she doesn't remember if she heard something or felt someone in the room, but she woke up, and she could see feet wearing socks sticking out from the end of her bed. She grabbed her bedside lamp and was about to hit the intruder when our neighbour yelled her name and said his name. And he couldn't explain why he was naked and only wearing socks, but he begged my mother to not tell his mother about it. My mother, of course, called the cops. She ended up going to court and making a victim impact statement against this guy because she was terrified that he'd become a teacher and be around children. And she says that she's pretty sure that he was there for me that night, and is so happy that I wasn't actually there. And we ended up moving immediately after this because she just couldn't stay another night in that house. So I've lived in a small town in Kentucky for pretty much my entire life, and because of that, I've been surrounded by the mountains and the woods for years. My current house is literally nestled into the woods in the middle of nowhere, and thus outdoor activities have taken up a huge chunk of my time, especially in the summer and the fall. I'm in the woods almost daily, hiking to the creeks to fish or meadows to hunt, and I know the woods and trails around my home like the back of my hand. That said, there is definitely something that calls to you while you're in those woods, especially when you're alone, and I've just now realized it after stumbling upon some of these stories. Before, I would always just brush it off, but nowadays, it's really hard for me to ignore it. So my parents began allowing me to hike alone when I was around 13, but I didn't really get into it until about 2 years later when I was 15. Even then, though, I wasn't allowed to go very far, and I always had to carry a walkie-talkie with me so I could contact my family if necessary. Later, at 17, I'd be allowed to carry a handgun with me, but that's neither here or there. There's some stories that I could tell at that age too, but this one takes place when I was 15. Before I get into it though, I should mention that I have 2 outside dogs, Max, a black lab, and Bo, a beagle. I've had both since I was very young, and they're super smart dogs, always staying by my side when I'm in the woods too. And they always listen to me. Until this day, that is. So I was hiking a trail that runs up beyond my aunt's house, one that I'd hike day in and day out, just kind of out and about, enjoying the woods. It was in October, so the weather was cool, not hot, and I'd been hiking for around an hour at this point. The trail comes out at a spring that runs down from the top of this particular mountain. It hadn't rained lately, so the spring was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I remember looking up the mountain, which I'd never hiked to the top of before, and just feeling this strange call. It wasn't really a voice, but it was just kind of an urge that I couldn't ignore. Keep in mind, too, that I'm a very timid person, and hiking unfamiliar trails on my own freaks me out even to this day. But that day, all my fear just had dissipated for some reason. The only way I can really describe it is that all thought of danger just left my head, and I just climbed higher and higher, and my dogs followed me. I don't even know how to describe the feeling that came over me, but I remember just staring down at my feet and feeling a peace as I climbed. There was a moment when I paused to look out at the houses below. I'd never been that high up before, I remembered, and I felt amazed. I took a picture on my phone, and then I looked around for my dogs, and Bo had already run off and Max was following. I called to them frantically to stop, but they just didn't listen. They disappeared. And at this point, looking down the mountainside, I just suddenly became very afraid. And I looked back uphill, and it just came over me again, and I kept hiking. I couldn't stop, and eventually I heard my walkie-talkie crackle. Everything was distorted, and I couldn't make out any of the words. I assume now that I was just out of range for it to pick up, but back then, it really freaked me out. Whatever had come over me lost its hold on my mind, though, and my dogs were still gone. Panicked, I began running downhill. It's a wonder I didn't get hurt. I was running that quickly. As I neared the wide section of the spring near the bottom, my walkie-talkie picked up, and I heard my dogs running downhill behind me. I got home eventually, and I mostly just forgot about it. I just told myself that I'd almost been lost and to just be more careful. Flash forward many years to now, though, and I still hike. I commented a short version of this second story in another place, but I'll add it here too. So at this point, Max is very old and no longer hikes with me, so it's just me and Bo. Last year, I hiked up to a cave behind my house, as I've done a million times before, and then I started following a trail that I'd never fully explored, just kind of out of curiosity. Bo was ahead of me per usual, but when I called her back, she came. We hiked for the better part of 45 minutes, following a pretty simple trail, and then I figured I'd better be heading back because it was beginning to get dark. And yet, I just couldn't stop. I kept telling myself that I'd just go a little bit further, see just a little bit more, and I remember looking back down at my feet, just like before, and listening to the silence of the woods around me, and just feeling that same peace again. It felt so easy to just keep going deeper and deeper, and so difficult to just turn around. Bo must have felt the call too, because even after I did break out of it and turned around, only after stumbling on a root, and then called back to her, she just wouldn't stop. I had to actually catch up with her and physically turn her around and put her before me so that she would follow me again. Now, I don't really know what the heck is going on out in those woods, but it's been on my mind a lot lately. I mean, what if I hadn't actually stumbled on that route? Or what if my mum hadn't decided to contact me on that static radio at that moment? How deep would I have actually hiked? And what was waiting for me in those depths? I don't know what's out there, but I know this. Those woods, they call to us.